Welcome, curious minds, to another deep dive. Have you ever, stopped to wonder why, even with all our amazing economic progress, we still seem to be grappling with these really big, persistent problems? I mean, things like resource depletion, the environmental crises that just keep going, and even like a rising tide of individual stress, crime, mental illness.
Yeah, it's quite a paradox, isn't it?
It really makes you question if just chasing material stuff, possessions, is actually delivering real well-being or contentment for everybody.
That's a really powerful observation.
Yeah.
And it's precisely the central challenge our source material dives right into.
Okay.
Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into this incredibly insightful text. It argues something pretty profound, that true efficiency and equity in our economies, they can only really be achieved if they're fundamentally rooted in strong moral values and, well, sound socioeconomic structures.
Right, not just tacked on.
Exactly. So our mission today is to unpack this whole idea. We'll explore why the systems we know best, capitalism, socialism, often seem to fall short, and what a truly holistic alternative might look like.
An alternative that puts people first.
One that genuinely puts humanity back at the center of economic thinking.
Yeah.
Rather than just focusing on, material excess for a select few.
Okay, let's get into it. So our main source for this deep dive is a detailed analysis from Dr. Chapra. He takes a critical look at both capitalism and socialism, and then he proposes something he calls an Islamic alternative.
It's quite a framework.
It really is an eye-opening perspective. It uses economic tools you'll probably recognize, but builds them on a completely different foundation. So yeah, get ready, because we're about to explore the very bedrock of how societies organize themselves economically.
All right. So first things first. Every economic system, regardless of its ideology, its label, it has to answer three fundamental questions.
Okay.
What should we produce? How should we produce it? And critically, for whom should we produce it?
Right. The what, how, and for whom.
Exactly. And the way a society answers those questions, that determines everything. How it allocates resources, how it distributes wealth, ultimately whether it actually meets the real needs of its people and achieves the goals it says it wants to achieve.
And here's where, for me anyway, it gets really interesting. Our source argues that these questions, they seem so straightforward, right? Like just practical economic decisions.
Yeah, on the surface.
But they're actually deeply, deeply value-laden. You can't answer them in some kind of neutral vacuum. Every economic system is underpinned by what the source calls a worldview.
A worldview, like a philosophy.
Yeah, essentially a comprehensive philosophy about, the origin of the universe, the meaning of human life, our relationship with each other, with the environment. Think of it like the invisible foundation of a building.
Okay, I see. You don't see it, but it holds everything up.
Exactly. It determines everything about the structure that stands on top of it.
Precisely. And from this foundational worldview, a system's entire strategy flows. Now, to be effective, this strategy needs specific mechanisms. It needs ways to filter all the competing claims on scarce resources.
Right, because resources are scarce.
They are. It needs ways to balance supply and demand, naturally, to motivate people, individuals, to perform their best, and also mechanisms to facilitate socioeconomic restructuring, change, in a way that leads to efficient and equitable allocation.
So without that clear worldview.
And without a clear and comprehensive worldview, the whole system can lack coherence. Its proclaimed goals, no matter how noble they sound, often just remain elusive, hard to reach.
Okay, so with that framework worldview shaping strategy, let's turn our attention to the system that's probably most familiar, certainly in the West, capitalism. Our source points out that, classical laissez-faire capitalism, that pure, totally hands-off market idea, that doesn't really exist anywhere in this pure form today.
No, it's been modified quite a bit over the centuries.
Yeah, governments have stepped in constantly to try and correct deficiencies. But even with those modifications, it still holds this huge appeal for many people.
It absolutely does. And, there are good reasons for that, often related to innovation, dynamism, wealth creation.
Sure.
However, despite that appeal, our source identifies some really critical failures, particularly when it comes to achieving equity, fairness.
Right.
That invisible hand of market forces, driven purely by self-interest, it has often led to what one observer described quite starkly as an inhumane, squalid, and unjust society of rampant commercialism, social division, and conflict.
Wow, that's strong language.
It is. And the source attributes a lot of this to several, unrealistic assumptions about the preconditions needed for capitalism to actually succeed in delivering those broader goals.
Okay, like what kind of assumptions?
Well, one of the core issues the source highlights is capitalism's basically secularist worldview,
Right.
which was largely shaped by the Enlightenment. The source poses this question. If there's no ultimate purpose in life beyond the material world, and if, as Sartre famously put it, everything is permitted, then what really anchors our values?
What stops it from being a free-for-all?
Exactly. Our source argues that this big push towards secularism effectively undermined religion's historical role as a kind of collective moral force. It left society without what it calls a socially agreed filter mechanism for moral values.
Interesting.
And it quotes the historians Will and Ariel Durant, who observe that there is no significant example in history before our time of a society successfully maintaining moral life without the aid of religion.
That's a pretty bold claim.
It is. But the argument is that this moral vacuum, where shared values might have guided actions, was largely filled by other things,
Like what?
like self-interest, prices, and profits becoming the primary criteria for allocating resources. Then you had utilitarianism, reinforced by materialism, providing a kind of philosophical justification for this single-minded pursuit of wealth and consumption.
So making money became the main virtue.
In effect, yeah, identifying maximum earnings with supreme virtue. And the source argues this has contributed significantly to a broader sort of moral decline within society.
So, okay, connecting this back to efficiency and equity, what are the practical consequences of this worldview, according to the source?
Well, some pretty stark ones. The rise of what's called positive economics.
Right, the idea that economics can be value-free.
Exactly. The claim was it's independent of any particular ethical position. But this led to value judgments becoming almost, well, forbidden, anathema.
Okay.
And this resulted in a concept called the Pareto optimum, becoming a real favorite in economic policy circles.
Can you unpack that a bit? Pareto optimum.
Sure. Essentially, it means a policy is considered efficient only if it makes at least one person better off without making anyone else worse off.
Okay, so nobody loses out.
Right. Sounds
Yeah.
reasonable on the surface, maybe. But the source argues it effectively grants a veto power to anyone who might be slightly inconvenienced by a change, even if that change benefits society greatly overall.
I can see how that would slow things down.
It leads to what the source calls a near paralysis of policymaking. Imagine trying to implement significant reforms under that constraint.
Yeah, tough.
And then, adding to this, you had social Darwinism creeping into economic thought.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. It sort of provided this justification for inequality, condoning poverty and unemployment by suggesting the poor were simply lazy or unenterprising.
Which conveniently lets the system off the hook.
Precisely. It freed economists from feeling a social obligation and kind of excused the system's inherent injustices.
So what were the actual results, the sour fruits, as the source puts it?
Well, despite decades, even centuries of incredible prosperity and huge wealth expansion in Western market economies, poverty hasn't been removed.
Still with us.
Very much so. And inequalities of income and wealth have actually increased in many cases. Plus, there's been significant economic instability, booms and busts, high unemployment at times, showing that both efficiency in a stable sense and equity have remained pretty elusive.
Why? What are the core reasons the source gives for this failure to deliver on both fronts?
It boils down to highlighting a few fundamental and frankly false assumptions at the heart of mainstream capitalist theory.
Okay.
First, there's the idea of the sovereign consumer. This assumes consumers will naturally limit their claims to just their needs.
But people want stuff they don't strictly need, right?
Exactly. Without strong, shared moral values acting as a brake, there's really no limit on wants. So the wealthy end up diverting scarce resources towards, inessential desires, luxuries, while often, ironically, blaming the poor for their own situation.
What's the second assumption?
Second, capitalism kind of implicitly assumes a reasonably equal distribution of income and wealth to begin with for the market to allocate efficiently.
Which is just not reality.
Not even close. Given things like inherited wealth, unequal access to credit, education, even differences in natural talent, it's inherently impossible. This massive imbalance allows the wealthy to disproportionately influence what gets produced, often steering resources towards socially less desirable products that cater to them.
Right. More luxury yachts, fewer affordable houses, maybe.
And third, there's the assumption that markets operate under perfect competition.
The textbook model.
Yeah. Which the source argues remains an unrealized dream. Why? Because capitalism itself, ironically, tends to promote big business, concentration of wealth, concentration of power. So competition has actually declined in many sectors, replaced by collusion, monopolies, oligopolies.
So the system's own dynamics undermine one of its key assumptions.
Exactly. The source argues the whole system rests on these fundamentally unrealistic assumptions. And that's why it struggles to deliver genuine equity and true broad-based efficiency.
That's a really clear breakdown. Now, you mentioned earlier the failures of capitalism, especially the absolute trauma of the 1930s Great Depression. That really paved the way for the rise of the welfare state.
It did, yes.
Yeah.
Heavily influenced by Keynesian economics.
Keynes, who famously kind of shattered that old idea that free markets just automatically fix themselves and ensure full employment.
Right. He argued for a much bigger role for government.
But, many people would point to capitalism's incredible success in driving innovation, creating wealth. Does the source just dismiss that, or how does it weigh those undeniable strengths against the shortcomings you've described?
That's a fair question.
Yeah.
The source doesn't really deny capitalism's capacity for wealth creation or innovation. It acknowledges that.
Okay.
Instead, it highlights that these strengths haven't automatically translated into, say, equitable distribution or the elimination of major social problems. The focus isn't on whether it can generate wealth, but on its inherent limitations in channeling that wealth effectively towards universal well-being and justice without a stronger moral foundation.
Yeah, I see. So it's about the direction and distribution of that wealth.
Precisely. And Keynes himself, while he was confident government could manage demand to fight depressions, he offered basically no advice on the priorities for public spending.
Interesting.
He focused mainly on the goal of full employment, seeming to assume that capitalism already handled resource allocation and income distribution reasonably well. And this lack of priorities, as the source calls it, became a really significant flaw in the welfare state model.
How so? What did that lead to?
Well, it led to significant economic problems down the line. You had deficit financing becoming more common.
Government spending more than they took in.
Right. And this, coupled with what the source calls a worldwide cult of consumerism.
Yeah, buy more stuff.
Resulted in rising private and public sector spending, often without any offsetting reductions elsewhere. The system basically encouraged everyone, individuals, governments, to make claims on resources that it simply couldn't satisfy within the real-world constraints of scarcity.
It sounds like writing checks the economy couldn't cash.
That's a good way to put it. And this massive overclaiming led directly to accelerating inflation, particularly from the 1950s right through to the 1980s. Prices rose, on average, more than 6 times over during that period in many Western countries.
Wow.
Now, initially, maybe this boosted output a bit, but ultimately it led to that painful condition called stagflation.
Right. Stagnation and inflation at the same time. High prices and high unemployment.
Exactly. A nightmare scenario. Plus, you had high debt servicing burdens building up from all the borrowing, especially for developing countries, which put the whole international monetary system at risk.
And what about the environment?
Critically, yes. This relentless focus on satisfying wants and chasing endless economic growth has also led to accelerated depletion of non-renewable resources and, frankly, severe ecological hazards that we're still dealing with today.
So bring it back to the welfare state's big goals, efficiency and equity. How did it fare, according to the source? Did its tools work?
The source argues that its main tools have largely failed to significantly reduce inequalities.
Really? Like what tools?
Well, take progressive taxation. The idea that the rich pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes.
Yeah, sounds fair.
In theory. But the source says it hasn't significantly reduced overall income disparities because of all the loopholes, exclusions, exemptions, deductions that often benefit the wealthy disproportionately.
Okay. What else?
Transfer payments and subsidies. Things like welfare benefits or support for certain industries. While some definitely aid the poor, the source points out that general subsidies, like broad food subsidies in the UK back in the 70s, or similar systems in Hungary, surprisingly often end up benefiting the rich more than the poor.
Huh. How does that happen?
Well, richer households often consume more of the subsidized goods in absolute terms, so they get a larger total benefit.
I see. What about economic growth itself? Wasn't that supposed to lift everyone up?
That was definitely the hope. High growth was seen as the main solution for inequality, partly because it allowed governments to avoid making difficult value judgments about redistribution, just grow the pie bigger for everyone. Yet the source points out that even in the world's richest countries, with decades of high growth, the essential needs of the poorest citizens often remain unfulfilled. And maybe more surprisingly, overall human happiness hasn't necessarily increased. Symptoms of what the source calls anomie, that sense of normlessness, social disconnection, persist, or even grow.
So growth alone isn't the magic bullet.
Apparently not. And even the core Keynesian objective of full employment has soured, hasn't it? Unemployment has remained stubbornly high in many parts of Europe, for instance, for long periods.
Yeah, that's true.
So yeah, the source's conclusion is pretty stark. The welfare state is in trouble. Its philosophical constraints, like trying to be value neutral, sticking to that Pareto optimality idea we talked about, they actually fuel this avalanche of claims on scarce resources.
It feeds the beast it's trying to tame.
In a way, yes. The very system encourages unchecked private consumption and allows for persistent public deficits, which perpetuates the imbalances and ultimately fails to solve the deep-seated problems of poverty and inequality.
Okay, so we've looked at the critiques of capitalism and the welfare state. Now, our source shifts gears to the other major economic ideology of the 20th century, socialism, particularly Marxism.
Right. The other side of the coin in many ways.
Marx, famously an avowed atheist, believed, and the source quotes him, criticism of religion is the foundation of all criticism. His ultimate dream, his vision, was for a classless, fraternal society, no wages, no private property driving conflict, eventually not even a state.
A utopian vision, really.
Yeah. But how did that dream measure up in reality, according to our source?
Well, the source is pretty blunt. It says the dream remains grossly unfulfilled.
How so?
In practice, the worker, far from being liberated, often just remained a wage earner, albeit for the state. Social classes, though maybe defined differently, absolutely persisted, and the state, far from withering away as Marx predicted.
It got bigger.
It became more powerful and more firmly entrenched than ever before in many cases. The source attributes this fundamental failure to a deep conflict between Marx's undeniably humanitarian goals and his underlying philosophy, plus the strategy he proposed to achieve them.
That's a really crucial point. Marx saw alienation as primarily caused by private property, right?
That was his main focus, yes.
So if alienation persisted even after private property was abolished in socialist states, what other sources of power or contributing factors did our source identify that maybe Marx missed or underestimated?
That's exactly the question the source raises. It argues the power doesn't just come from owning property. It stems from many sources think about mental ability, access to education, charisma, holding leadership positions within the party or bureaucracy.
Right. Power can concentrate in different ways.
Precisely. And Marx's strategy, which involved abolishing private ownership and establishing state control through central planning, effectively just transferred absolute power to a new group, the Politburo members, the central planners. This, the source argues, simply led to new forms of exploitation and critically failed to genuinely reduce that sense of alienation for the average worker. The core problem wasn't property per se, but the concentration of unaccountable power.
Okay, so let's talk about the practical implementation. Central planning. How did that actually work out? What were its limitations?
It faced really severe limitations. Perhaps the most fundamental was a massive lack of information.
Information.
Yeah. The economist Friedrich Hayek famously argued this point. Central planners, no matter how smart or well-intentioned, simply couldn't access or process the sheer volume of complex, constantly changing information about consumer preferences, local production costs, resource availability, all the things needed to make literally millions of efficient decisions every day.
Whereas a free market, theoretically, processes that information through prices.
Exactly. The interactions of supply and demand in a market system generate price signals that convey that information almost organically, decentrally. Central planning lacked that mechanism.
What were some other issues?
Well, ineffective subsidies were another major problem. Take food subsidies in the former Soviet Union, for example. The source notes they constituted a staggering 10% of the entire GNP.
Wow, huge.
Massive. But who benefited most? Often the richer urban populations, not necessarily the poorest. And these artificially low prices penalize farmers, absolutely killing their incentives to produce efficiently.
Any specific examples of that?
Yeah, there's a striking anecdote the source mentions. Apparently, bread was sometimes so cheap due to subsidies that children were seen using loaves of bread as footballs.
Good grief. That really drives home the point about distorted incentives, doesn't it? It shows how seemingly good intentions, like keeping food cheap, can lead to incredibly wasteful and counterproductive outcomes if the underlying system isn't working properly.
Absolutely. The vivid illustration. This also led to widespread rigidity in the system and chronic shortages of goods people actually wanted.
Empty shelves.
Empty shelves, long queues, stagnant state-set prices led to waste of unwanted goods, often poor quality for the things that were available, and severe shortages of others. This inevitably fueled black markets.
Where those with connections or money could get things anyway.
Exactly. The rich could often buy what they wanted on the black market, while the poor queued for hours or simply went without. And finally, there was just a profound lack of incentives for efficiency.
Because state enterprises didn't face competition.
Right. No real competition, no profit motive driving innovation or cost cutting. This led to massive inefficiency. The Soviet Union, for instance, is cited as using about 2.5 times more energy than OECD countries per unit of economic output.
That's an incredible amount of waste.
Staggering. The overall result was a dramatic decline in Soviet economic growth rates, starting from the 1960s onwards. It slowed and slowed until, by the mid-1980s, the source states there was essentially no growth at all.
And that must have really hurt the appeal of the Soviet model internationally.
Hugely, especially when contrasted with the dynamic growth seen in places like Japan or South Korea during the same period. It became much harder to sell the Soviet system as a superior path to prosperity.
So this systemic failure, this stagnation, eventually led to attempts at reform, didn't it? Like glasnost and perestroika under Gorbachev.
Yes, it did, facing reality. However, the source questions how deep these reforms could really go without fundamentally changing the system's core identity. It notes this inherent contradiction, trying to reintroduce market mechanisms and incentives while still clinging to the old, centrally planned, state-dominated structure.
Halfway house that didn't quite work.
It seemed that way. Countries that went furthest in liberalizing within that socialist framework, the source mentions Yugoslavia, Poland, even early reforms in China, often experienced serious problems like hyperinflation, mounting debt, and significant social turmoil. It suggests this was a kind of contradiction in terms, as long as the old paternalistic goals and structures persisted without a truly fundamental shift.
And even market socialism.
The source concludes that even attempts at market socialism, trying to blend planning with market elements, ultimately fail to deliver genuine equity if they lack that proper worldview, and, crucially, that effective moral filter mechanism we discussed earlier in the context of capitalism's failures. The underlying philosophical foundation matters.
Okay, so after this critical tour through capitalism, the welfare state, and socialism, finding significant shortcomings in all of them, our source finally turns to propose what it calls an Islamic alternative.
Yes, and it's important to stress this isn't presented as just a tweak here or there, or simply a different set of economic tools.
It's more fundamental.
Much more. It's presented as a complete, integrated worldview that actively seeks to combine both moral and material well-being, not seeing them as separate, but intertwined.
Interesting. What are the core concepts underpinning this alternative?
It's rooted in two foundational Islamic concepts. First, Tawhid.
What do you mean?
The absolute oneness of God. This implies that everything ultimately belongs to God and humans are accountable to Him. The second is Khilafah.
And Khilafah?
This refers to the understanding of humanity's role as God's vicegerents, stewards, or trustees on Earth. We've been entrusted with the planet's resources.
So it gives life a purpose beyond just existing.
Exactly. These ideas together are seen to uplift human dignity and provide life with a profound meaning and mission. Namely, to act in accordance with divine guidance, which includes fulfilling our obligations towards others and towards the creation itself.
How does this compare to, say, other views of human nature?
Well, it contrasts sharply with purely deterministic views, or with concepts like original sin found in some traditions. It emphasizes human potential for good and responsibility. And very importantly, it places a greater emphasis on duties than on rights.
Duties over rights. That sounds different.
It is a different emphasis. The fundamental wisdom here, as presented in the source, is that if everyone conscientiously fulfills their duties towards God, towards each other, towards the environment, then self-interest gets naturally constrained. And as a result, everyone's legitimate rights are protected and safeguarded. It's a subtle but significant shift in perspective.
Okay, so if that's the worldview, what's the core objective of this Islamic economic approach?
The central objective is summed up in the Arabic term adala,
$1.
which means comprehensive justice. It aims to eradicate all forms of what's called zulm. Zulm basically means wrongdoing, inequity, exploitation, injustice in all its forms. It's a very broad concept. The commitment to adala is paramount. Our source even quotes the renowned medieval scholar Ibn Taymiyyah. He says something quite striking. God upholds the just state, even if it is unbelieving, but does not uphold the unjust state, even if it is believing.
Wow. So justice is the key criterion, regardless of religious label.
That's the implication. Justice is foundational. And this deep commitment to justice demands that all resources, which remember are seen as a sacred trust, an amana from God, must be utilized to achieve what are known as the maqasid al-sharia.
Maqasid al-sharia, the higher goals.
Exactly, the higher objectives or goals of Islamic law, which represent the overall well-being of the community.
Okay, what are these maqasid, these higher goals?
The source outlines several key ones relevant to economics. First, need fulfillment. This means ensuring everyone has access to a humane and respectable standard of living, enough to live with dignity. But crucially, within limits encouraging simple living, avoiding extravagance, waste, or status-seeking snobbery.
There's a moral dimension to consumption.
Absolutely. As the Prophet Muhammad is reported to have said, he is not a man of faith who eats his fill when his neighbor is hungry. That sense of collective responsibility is key.
Okay, what's next?
Second, ensuring a respectable source of earning. Everyone should have the opportunity to earn a dignified livelihood through legitimate work. Third, and this is central, equitable distribution of income and wealth. Achieving fairness in how wealth is spread is not just a side benefit, it's a core imperative.
Unlike systems where it's more of an afterthought.
Potentially, yes. And fourth, ensuring growth and stability. The goal isn't no growth, but sustainable economic development that benefits the whole community and future generations.
Right. So those are the goals. They sound comprehensive, definitely focused on justice and well-being. But the big question is, how does this translate into a practical strategy? How does it actually propose to overcome those deep-seated problems we discussed with capitalism and socialism? What are the tools?
That's the critical link. The source argues it requires a whole package of interconnected tools all working together and all needing to be in harmony with that foundational worldview we talked about.
Okay, what's the most important tool?
Perhaps the most crucial and the one most distinct from secular systems is what the source calls a moral filter and motivating system.
A moral filter, like the one capitalism lacked.
Exactly. But here, unlike in secular systems where values can be seen as subjective or relative, the idea is that divine sanction makes certain moral rules absolute and, ideally, universally accepted within that society. This provides that socially agreed filter mechanism needed to guide choices beyond just pure self-interest or profit maximization.
And the motivation part.
The belief in ultimate accountability before God provides a powerful internal motivation that, the source argues, self-interest alone simply cannot match. It pushes individuals to act conscientiously, consider the social good, even when it demands personal sacrifice or effort that won't be immediately rewarded in material terms.
Can you give an example of that motivation?
Well, the source emphasizes a powerful hadith, a recorded saying or tradition of the Prophet Muhammad. It describes a person who arrives on the day of judgment, apparently rich in good deeds, prayers, charity, etc. But because they wronged others in life, perhaps cheated someone, insulted someone, harmed someone, their good deeds are transferred to those they wronged until they have nothing left. They become morally bankrupt.
Wow. That's a very strong image about consequences.
It is. It highlights the profound importance placed on how one treats others and fulfills obligations in daily life, especially in economic dealings. That belief system is meant to be the primary motivator.
Okay, that's the moral foundation. But what about the more concrete socioeconomic and financial structures? What needs to change there?
It's quite extensive. First, it involves actively changing consumer preferences.
Oh, you can't just tell people what to want.
Not directly telling, no, but encouraging a different mindset. The source mentions classifying goods into categories: necessities, daruriyat, things that add convenience, hajiyat, and then refinements or comforts, tasiniyat. The idea is to meet the necessities for all, allow for conveniences, but actively discourage wasteful luxuries, excessive consumption, and status-driven snobbery.
So shaping demand through values.
Exactly. To free up scarce resources for everyone's fundamental needs, rather than having them diverted to satisfy the insatiable wants of a few. Then there's an active role for the state.
So not laissez-faire, but not central planning either.
Precisely. Not a police state and not the primary owner of everything like in communism, but a state that actively works to ensure those maqasid, those higher goals, are actually being met. It's seen as a facilitator.
How does it facilitate?
Primarily through relying on cultivating moral consciousness in society, promoting positive reforms, using incentives rather than just coercion, basically enabling the private sector and individuals to act in accordance with the desired values.
What about things like taxes and government spending? Fiscal policy.
Yes, fiscal reform is key. This means carefully prioritizing public spending. For example, questioning excessive military spending if the country isn't genuinely threatened. Making the tax system genuinely equitable, yes to progressive taxation, but ensuring it's applied fairly and tackling tax evasion seriously.
And government debt.
Restraining deficits is crucial, avoiding over-reliance on inflationary money creation or excessive borrowing. And very importantly, encouraging voluntary mechanisms like AQUAF.
AQUAF, you mentioned those earlier. Charitable trusts.
Yes, charitable endowments or trusts. Historically, these played a huge role in Muslim societies, funding hospitals, schools, infrastructure. The idea is to revive and encourage these kinds of philanthropic initiatives to share the burden of providing social services, reducing the load on the government budget.
Interesting. What else in terms of restructuring?
A major focus is on agricultural and rural reforms, recognizing that in many developing countries, the majority of the poor live in rural areas.
So tackling issues like land ownership.
Exactly. Addressing excessive concentration of land ownership through fair land reform, maybe setting ceilings on holdings, distributing land to the landless or small farmers, ensuring just compensation. Also, improving the terms of tenancy for farmers who don't own land. This is seen as vital for tackling poverty at its roots.
What about big business? We talked about concentration of power under capitalism.
Good point. The source calls for wider ownership and control of corporations, reforming corporate structures to prevent excessive concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, promoting broader participation, maybe through cooperative models or employee share schemes.
And finance, banking, that's often a big issue.
Huge. A core element is financial restructuring. This means moving away from an interest-based Riba banking system towards models based on risk sharing and reward sharing, like profit and loss sharing partnerships. Mudaba or Musharaka.
Why is that so important?
The argument is that interest-based debt finance tends to favor the already wealthy, makes debt accumulation easier, and can be exploitative. Risk-sharing models are seen as promoting a more equitable distribution of credit and opportunity, particularly helping small and medium enterprises, SMEs, and small farmers get access to capital based on the viability of their projects, not just their existing collateral.
So it could help level the playing field for entrepreneurs.
That's the goal. These SMEs and small farms are seen as absolutely critical engines for job creation and poverty reduction. The source even cites the success of microfinance institutions like the Grameen Bank, noting its high repayment rates, around 99%, as evidence that the poor are reliable borrowers when given fair opportunities.
Okay, that's a lot on the economic structure. What about people themselves?
Education. Absolutely central. Education and training are key, but with a specific focus. The goal isn't just technical skills, but creating well-rounded human beings, good and productive. This means inculcating those core Islamic values of honesty, responsibility, community service, alongside imparting necessary technical and professional skills.
And access to education.
Ensuring fair access for all is critical, including those in remote rural areas and urban slums who are often left behind.
And finally, what about the political system? Does that need reform too?
Yes, the source emphasizes political reform. It argues this economic vision requires legitimate governments that are accountable both to God, in terms of upholding justice and the Masid, and accountable to the people they govern.
So democracy.
It emphasizes fostering freedom of expression and, crucially, practicing shura.
Shura.
Meaning meaningful consultation. Governments should consult widely with the public, ensuring broad participation in decision-making. It implies a responsive and representative form of governance, though the exact mechanisms might vary.
Wow. Okay, so when you put it all together, the moral filter, the consumer changes, the state's role, fiscal reform, rural reform, corporate reform, financial reform, education, political reform, it really isn't just tinkering, is it?
Not at all.
This sounds like a deeply integrated, comprehensive approach. All the different policies, fiscal, monetary, production, social, they're meant to be aligned within one strategic plan, all drawing inspiration from that underlying Sharia framework.
That's the core idea. The ultimate aim, as the source presents it, is to essentially humanize market forces, to harness the dynamism of private initiative, but channel it firmly towards serving the broader social interest, guided by justice and those maqasid.
It's fascinating how the source argues these diverse elements aren't just, a random collection of policies.
Oh, they're designed to be synergistic.
Right. To work together, reinforcing each other to achieve those big overarching goals of justice and well-being for the whole community.
Precisely. It's about creating a coherent system where the values, the motivations, the institutions, and the policies all pull in the same direction.
So after that really deep dive, what does this all mean for you, our listener? You're looking to get knowledge quickly, but also thoroughly. What's the big takeaway here?
Well, I think this exploration powerfully suggests that the success or failure of any economic system, it isn't just about the GDP numbers or the specific market mechanisms used, as important as those might seem.
It goes deeper.
It goes much deeper. It's fundamentally about the underlying worldview, that philosophy we started with. It's about the moral compass that guides human actions within that system. And it's about the society's genuine commitment to achieving justice, adala, for all its members, not just a privileged few.
It's a really powerful reminder, isn't it, that material prosperity alone, just having more stuff, doesn't automatically guarantee human fulfillment or happiness.
Not at all. Instead, the source argues true societal well-being, that genuinely good life for everyone, seems to hinge on successfully integrating these profound moral values right into the very fabric, the DNA of our economic and political structures.
Which really leaves us with a pretty important question for you to think about, doesn't it?
I think so.
In a world like ours, still wrestling with such persistent poverty, growing inequality, and these escalating environmental crises, can we ever achieve true efficiency and true equity without some kind of shared, deeply held moral framework?
A framework that genuinely motivates individuals, businesses, governments to prioritize collective well-being, long-term sustainability, and justice over just short-term, unbridled self-interest.
Our source today makes a really compelling case that it's precisely this missing dimension, this moral core, that might hold the key to unlocking a truly flourishing society for everyone. Something to ponder.
Definitely food for thought. What stands out to you from this deep dive? We really hope this exploration has given you some fresh perspectives, some profound new insights to consider.
Absolutely. Join us next time on The Deep Dive for more fascinating journeys into the heart of complex topics.